Welcome to One Planet Conservation Awareness, and today we're celebrating World Wetlands Day, a day to appreciate the impact that wetlands have on biodiversity, our communities, and their role in climate mitigation. We are joined by a member of the world's largest wetland-orientated conservation program, Wetlands International. Ward is here to tell us about the conservation and restoration of wetlands. Ward, thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps you can start by giving yourself a bit of an introduction and also introducing us to what we mean by wetlands.
Thank you very much and good day to everybody. My name, as said, is Wart. That's the way I pronounce it, Wart Hagemeyer. I work with Wetlands International out of its global office, which is based in the Netherlands, but is really one office in a network of organizations that make up Wetlands International. And as the name says, we are dedicated to the wise use, restoration and conservation of wetlands worldwide. And wetlands is a term everybody uses, but it is a scientifically quite complex a definition of it. It's basically where water in the landscape has had such an impact that the life is adapted to it. Now that's a nice definition, but what does it mean in practice? It's really those places that everybody knows, like marshes, but also rivers and lakes, swamps, even peat swamp forests, which are forests on soils that are dominated by water, peats in themselves, which are compilations of organic matter in the ground that often contain a lot of water. And these are remarkably common around the world. Most of the Arctic is peatland, for example, but also a lot of the rainforests in the world are on peatlands. So these are extremely important wetlands around the world. So basically, in all our lives, all around us, we're constantly living in wetland landscapes. Of course, there are some exceptions like the Sahara or other deserts where it's hard to see water, but even there are wetlands that are those places that in the events when there is water, you get these kind of temporary wetlands, and even those are included in wetlands. And then obviously, there's a lot of the world is covered by seas. Not all the seas and the complete seas are included in wetlands, but the more shallow stretches of the sea are included in wetlands as well.
So the term wetlands really encompasses a huge variety of ecosystems. From rivers to seas and to marshes and jungles as well. So working across the world, these ecosystems must be home to an incredible amount of different species. Could you give us a bit of an introduction to what species and what sort of ecosystems depend on the wetlands?
Yes, well, the way you described it, it's a remarkable range of ecosystems. So the range of species living in it is also very, very wide. The human being is one of the most prominent species living in wetlands and depending on wetlands for its survival. But then in terms of what we normally call biodiversity, so the range of the diversity of species around the world, a very large component of it also lives or depends on wetlands. Think about fishes, obviously, living in the water, but also those that not always live in the water, but part of their life cycle or life depend on water. Migratory water birds, often breeding in the northern areas in the Arctic and migrating down to the warmer places in the world where, when it's cold in the north, there's still food. Those depend often on these wetlands to stop over. So you have birds migrating using chains of wetlands around the world in so-called flyways, let's say the routes they use to move during the year. So migratory water birds are a very visible and important component of wetland biodiversity. But things like hippopotamus, what do you call these things in English? Otters, beavers, there's a lot of mammals therefore. But amphibia are important groups living and depending on wetlands. Dragonflies, a lot of insects. So a very, very wide range of species that make up an incredible, important part of the biodiversity of the world live and depend on wetlands.
So key habitats for many, many different species. And you mentioned at the beginning there that also humans often heavily depend on wetlands around the world. So could you give us a bit of a brief introduction to what kind of communities depend on wetlands around the world and for what reasons?
Well, what would the world be without water? There would be severe issue. Well, there would not be an issue because there would be no life if there's no water. So life depends on water, and water is provided by, we can call it the natural infrastructure for water. That's what wetlands are basically. So humans depend on wetlands for water, but on much more. I mean, the water comes in a controlled way, in a naturally controlled way. So if there would be no wetlands, there would be very much more flooding. So wetlands provide a buffer to the amount of water and the way it is available. So it makes sure that the water is available in the way that we can benefit from it, because we're used to the way water is available. It's there in rivers, in lakes, and when the snow melts, it comes down in larger amounts. But the wetlands again buffer that amount and make sure that it doesn't even come in huge peaks, but then it's dampened so that we are not all flooded. So flood prevention is a very important role for wetlands. A lot of vegetation grows in wetlands, which is subsequently used by people for building material, reeds, especially in places where the communities are still living very much within the wetlands and depending on wetlands. You see these kind of uses of all kind of building materials and other livelihood supporting materials from wetlands. And when I say livelihoods, that's the way that people derive a certain amount of wealth and support for their living from wetlands. It can be fishes, it can be the harvesting of water birds, it can be the harvesting of certain plants that grow in the water and that they use for food. So a very, very wide range of services that the wetlands provide to people. And then I have not even mentioned yet the service to the regulation of the climate, and that's an increasingly important topic in this world and this time, where carbon emissions cause the climate, the temperatures to go up, and where wetlands are one of the major stores of carbon in the world. The peatlands I mentioned earlier are a major store, the major store of carbon in the natural systems in the world, and maintaining these peatlands can therefore keep the carbon in the ground, and the wetlands absorb a lot of that carbon as well in their functioning. So they are both very important in mitigating climate change. That means regulating climate and ensuring that the climate change is not stronger than it already is by keeping carbon into the system. And it can help to adapt to climate change, which is further stronger peaks in flows, etc., are being dampened by wetlands. So both in mitigation and adaptation to climate, wetlands are a key ecosystem.
So wetlands are key for not only the biodiversity, but also us humans, not just relying on them for our livelihoods, but also protecting us against impending issues of climate change. So these wetlands are obviously very important, but what are some of the problems that wetlands are facing around the world, and why do Wetlands International dedicate their work to protecting these ecosystems?
Wetlands are all around us, and we are often in the wetlands. People live in places where wetlands are very important. Think about coasts and deltas, for example, where we often see large concentrations of people in the deltas of big rivers where they flow into the sea. And that is because those systems provide a huge productivity and a very good geographic location for people to be strategically positioned. But the influence that people have by living there is also causing, in many cases, a strong degradation of the natural health of those wetlands. And that is not only true in the coast and the deltas, but throughout the world, where people have often chosen wetlands to be either located in or close to and use them for their livelihoods and other services. they feel protected by the wetlands, and they get a lot of services provisioned by the wetlands. So the interaction of people and wetlands is a very intimate one. They provide a lot of benefits to the people, but by being there, people often have a degrading impact on those wetlands. And in many, many cases, actually, the wetlands have been completely dried out and changed into something completely else, into a harbor, or into, I don't know, a parking lot, or into agriculture, which still uses the water, but has changed the characteristics of the wetlands completely. So of the natural ecosystems around the world, wetlands are amongst those that have been changed most and have lost a lot of their natural ability to provide those services to both people and biodiversity. And if we look at some of the declines of wetlands in the last decades, then that is at an alarming rate. And that is why Wetlands International looks at conserving what is still there, but also expressing a strong need to, with other stakeholders, work on restoring what has already been lost. And then not just restoring in terms of creating something that is green again, but really try to restore back those values and functions that the wetlands were providing before they became affected.
So human modification is having a big impact on wetlands, but also what wetlands can do for us. But what about the impacts of climate change on the wetlands? You talked about how wetlands can help us mitigate climate change, but also some of the effects that we're already seeing are having their own impact on wetlands themselves.
Yes, this same, let's say, complex interaction between climate and wetlands, where wetlands are an important feature in mitigating climate change, but at the same time is heavily affected by climate change. If the temperatures rise, the water comes in higher volumes from melting glaciers and in a different flow pattern than it used to be before. There is sharper differences between drought and rain, for example. We see climate patterns changing around the world, and this has a direct impact on the availability of water in wetlands. And since wetlands shape the water availability, but also the water availability shape the wetlands, this very intimate relationship between the two make that both the way they impact and they are impacted are very much linked to how climate change is moving forward. A lot of the issues around what Wetlands International, their wetlands in the world, the way they are lost or degraded, are often, well, it's pointed to climate change. This is causing everything. But most cases, actually, it is the way that people behave, often in response to climate change, that has the bigger impact on the wetlands. So both climate change directly and the response of people to the climate change drive these issues that degrade and converse wetlands. And therefore, we need to find a balance in how can we address the issues that come forward from climate change, how can we adapt to climate change, and in the process not do more damage to wetlands, but use those wetlands, work with those wetlands, build with the nature that the wetlands represent to provide the solutions to climate change. So this building with nature and using ecosystem-based solutions, nature-based solutions, is one of the core ways of working that Wetlands International is implementing itself and promoting for use by other stakeholders.
So you touched on some of the work that Wetlands International is doing and working with local communities, but perhaps you can highlight some of the major projects and ways in which Wetlands International are trying to help these incredibly important ecosystems.
Yeah, so I ended talking about this working with nature-based solutions, and I mentioned this building with nature, which is one of the very important programs that we are developing. We are protecting coasts and people living on coasts against the impact of water, seawater often, by building coastal resilience of both the people and the ecosystems against flooding. And instead of building against the nature, creating hard concrete walls or dikes, etc., we try to work with nature, restoring and implementing healthy ecosystems that help mitigate the impacts of water coming in. So we restore coastlines based on ecosystems rather than just dikes. Often we combine some engineering into those ecosystems to ensure that they do provide sufficient protection against flooding. But building with nature and implementing coastal protection through healthy wetlands is one of the big programs we do, for example, in Indonesia, where we've been demonstrating this very successfully in a large stretch of coast on Java. And we're now extending this concept much more into wider application across Asia in what we call Building with Nature Asia program that is being rolled out. So that's a very prominent and visible program that we're running out. And in that, often mangroves play a large role. Mangroves are trees that grow on the edge between salt water, often where there's also a little bit of fresh water. They root well in the soil, and they provide protection against wave energy, and they stabilize sediments. So that's one of the examples of an ecosystem component that we use to create that stability. And we do that, as I said, in Indonesia, but mangrove work much wider around the world, because mangroves occur in a, let's say, a tropic belt around the world. And everywhere where they are, they provide very important services to people and biodiversity. So we have some programs that try to promote the conservation, restoration, and wise use of these mangroves. Another important component of work that we do is on flyway work. We conserve wetlands as change of migratory corridors, flyways for birds. And in doing that, we preserve the wetlands themselves. So we focus on wetlands that are important in that chain of migration. And then we work on the ground and we create healthy wetlands that can provide that stepping stone in that migration. And we do that in all the major flyways in the world. Most experience we have now in the Africa-Eurasia flyway, which is from, let's say, northern Russia through Europe into Africa. That for many decades already we have been doing flyway work there, and we are doing some projects that focus on coastal areas but also on inland areas. And maybe I can give an example of some work in Ethiopia, where we, in the so-called climate resilient flyways project, look at how in the context of climate change, the sites that are so important for these migratory waterbirds need to be managed to maintain that role, and how therefore climate adaptation takes into account the importance of wetlands for biodiversity, and specifically migratory waterbirds as well. So that's another example of work in Africa, where we also work, for example, in the inner Niger Delta, which is in the Sahelian zone, an area where the river causes large floodings every year naturally, which provides a chain of life to people there. The water floods every year into these large floodplains and facilitates people to, after that, go in with their cattle for grazing, to capture the water and the fishes during the wet season and make sure it reproduces into fish populations that they can harvest. There's large millions of people live on that flooding pattern, and we are trying to work with the authorities to maintain some of that flooding pattern and the values that the associated wetlands provide to the people and the biodiversity, in a context where, because of climate change, but also because of the need for electricity and agriculture, large dams are built in the river to kind of control the water, use the water for agriculture, and avoid flooding in some places. So we're trying to find a balance that, within the needs to secure and save the benefits of water for agriculture and people, we can also make sure that the wetlands get enough water to continue to provide their services to people and biodiversity in that hugely important area. If I move one continent further to the west and in the Americas, we're working in large corridors of rivers between the Pantanal and Argentina, Buenos Aires, where there is a connection of wetlands that also provide a whole corridor azul, a blue corridor for life of both biodiversity and people. And we have a similar focus on trying to maintain that connectivity in the landscape and work with all the stakeholders in that landscape to maintain the values of the wetlands for both people and biodiversity. So those are some of the examples of projects that we do around the world. Bringing in that integrated thinking about how wetlands are important to people and biodiversity, and seeking to strengthen wetlands rather than fight against them.
But what are some of the methods for convincing these local stakeholders that it's better to restore and protect the wetlands so that they can benefit from these ecosystem services? How do you convince them that it's better to do this and not, divert this water for agriculture or something else? How do you find that balance with the local communities?
Yeah, that balance with the local communities is actually often quite easy to find that balance, because they live in the wetlands. They directly derive the benefits from the wetlands, and they see that when the wetlands disappear, they lose these benefits. It's at higher policy levels, at the level of governments, where often we need to start convincing or demonstrating the interests of the governments in maintaining these wetlands as well, because often the traditional way of working is pouring concrete to fight issues with wetlands. And this has obviously come also from a very strong vested interest of the building and engineering community, who have provided very valuable solutions, but then also created a whole economy around that. So this sector is very important. It provides many solutions, but it has also grown to become, let's say, the standard way of working, without really considering how much damage it does and how much it would actually be able to provide and arrive at the same solutions or the same outcome with a solution that is healthier for the environment. So often the people on the ground feel the direct benefits, and they often are very much with us in understanding how it makes sense to maintain the wetlands. At higher policy levels, we often have a bit of a harder battle. But there, even if you do the full socio-economics of the system, comparing what the real costs are, also expressed in terms of all these ecosystem services, if you try to put a money value on those, and you put them above and below the line for what will be gained and what will be lost, and what are the investments and what are the returns, then it also works out to demonstrate that the picture is more positive when you work with the maintenance of the wetlands rather than fight against the wetlands, especially in the long run, because the services will continue to be provided by the wetlands if you work with them, while a lot of them will be lost over a duration of time when you just go for the normal hard engineering solutions often.
It's clear that Wetlands International has certainly got a large job on their hand protecting these wetlands, but it sounds like there's been a lot of success to celebrate. So how can people support the work that Wetlands International do?
That's a very good question. We try to work in wide partnerships by working with the communities that you have already described. I've described how we need the governments and the policymakers to think with us, so we work with them as well. And many of these ways of working demonstrate new initiatives, new ways of thinking. So we're trying to change the paradigm often, and it is often hard to find yourself into a normal economic role that pays for itself, because you're trying to change something for which the mainstream economic justification has not yet grown. So we are trying to actually build that justification. This means we often work with projects from international donors that see the innovative way and see the need for change and see the innovative role that Wetlands International can play. And while those are often the GEFs, the Global Environment Facilities, the World Banks, and national governments in the world, there are also large private foundations that recognize that Wetlands International does very valuable work. So we get, we apply for grants from them. We also, for example, if we think about the waterbird work, we have a waterbird fund, which is open for donations from, well, you name it, individuals, but also organizations that see a merit in doing this type of work and that can make a donation into the Waterbird Fund. And Wetlands International is also receiving donations directly. So on our website, you can find these options for supporting our work in terms of money. But obviously, money is not the only way to support our work. A lot of the success in wetland conservation depends on involvement of movements, of getting ideas vested in large groups of people who will then well, demand those solutions to be implemented. So we are trying to work with youth to get the thinking more embedded in the, let's say, the normal way youth thinks about their environment. And we would like to see youth joining that movement and thinking with us, working with us, advocating with us for the conservation of wetlands. We have international volunteer programs through which you can count waterbirds and contribute your data to the database that helps then protect the wetlands that are so important for those waterbirds. So on our website, we have a range of options to join our movement and to become a supporter of Wetlands International in the work that we do. So on the one hand, money helps, but on the other hand, certainly also involvement, support helps to get the message across and to become a stronger organization and to help save wetlands around the world.
That sounds great. And I'm sure many people watching this will jump onto your website to find out more and also support your cause. Well, thank you so much for joining us and telling us all about wetlands. It feels as though just from sitting here, we've traveled across the world to have an insight into some of your amazing work. So thank you for talking to us on World Wetlands Day, and we hope you the best of success with your continued efforts to protect our world's wetlands.
Thank you very much, and hope to see you somewhere in a wetland.